Step out of the car and keep your hands where I can see them. The voice cut through the rain like a blade against glass. Marcus Reed tightened his grip on the steering wheel for half a second before slowly letting go. Red and blue lights flashed across the wet highway, washing the inside of his dark grey Lexus in pulses of color that made the night feel unreal. Interstate 85 stretched empty behind him, slick with rainwater and glowing beneath scattered streetlights. Marcus glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:47 p.m. 12 hours earlier, cameras had flashed in his face while reporters called his name outside the state capitol building in Raleigh. Now he sat alone on the shoulder of a highway with a police cruiser behind him and rain tapping steadily against the windshield. He lowered the driver's side window halfway. Cold air rushed inside, carrying the sharp smell of wet asphalt. The officer approached slowly, one hand resting near his belt, flashlight beam cutting across the interior. Marcus reached calmly for his wallet. "License and registration," the officer said flatly. Marcus nodded once and handed them over without speaking. The flashlight moved upward, stopping on his face. Silence followed. A long silence. Then the officer leaned closer toward the open window, squinting beneath the brim of his rain-speckled patrol cap. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Marcus felt something old shift quietly in his chest. The officer's mouth curled into a crooked smile. "No way." He lowered the flashlight slightly. "Locker boy." Marcus looked up fully now. Dylan Mercer. 20 years older. Broader shoulders. Same pale eyes. Same smug expression that used to appear right before humiliation followed. Rainwater slid from the edge of Dylan's cap onto the pavement below. For a moment neither man spoke. But Marcus didn't need words. The memories came anyway. A school hallway smelling like bleach and cafeteria pizza. Metal locker doors slamming shut. Sneakers squeaking across polished tile floors. Laughter echoing off painted cinderblock walls while a younger Dylan Mercer stood in the center of it all like a king holding court. Marcus had spent most of high school trying to become invisible. Poor black kid from the east side. Worn-out backpack. Thrift store sneakers. Mother working night shifts cleaning office buildings downtown. Every day felt like surviving weather. And Dylan had always known exactly where to apply pressure. Marcus blinked once, pulling himself back to the present. The rain intensified, drumming harder against the roof. Dylan glanced at the license in his hand, then back at Marcus. "Marcus Reed," he said slowly. "Man. Haven't seen you since graduation." Marcus kept his voice even. "It's been a while." Dylan chuckled under his breath. "Yeah. Guess life didn't change much though, ho." His flashlight swept deliberately across the older Lexus interior. Still driving beat-up cars in the middle of the night. Marcus said nothing. The silence seemed to irritate Dylan more than any comeback could have. Dylan stepped back slightly and motioned toward the shoulder behind the vehicle. "Know why I pulled you over?" Marcus already knew the answer didn't matter. "No, officer." Dylan smirked at the word officer. "You drifted across the lane marker about half a mile back." Marcus nodded calmly. "I understand." Another pause. Dylan studied him carefully now, almost disappointed. Like he had expected anger. Or fear. Or maybe the nervous, stuttering teenager he used to corner beside the gym lockers after football practice. Instead, Marcus sat still with both hands resting visibly near the steering wheel, his charcoal suit jacket folded neatly in the passenger seat beside him. The gold state seal embossed on a leather folder peeked faintly from underneath the fabric before disappearing again in the shifting patrol lights. Dylan didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care. "You been drinking tonight?" Dylan asked. "No, mind stepping out of the vehicle." Marcus slowly opened the door. Rain immediately soaked the shoulders of his white dress shirt as he stepped onto the pavement. The cold hit instantly. Water gathered along the highway shoulder and soaked into the edges of his black shoes. Dylan circled around him casually, flashlight beam trailing across the car like a searchlight hunting for something suspicious. "Funny, Dylan," muttered. "Back in school everybody thought you'd disappear." Marcus looked out toward the dark highway instead of responding. Cars hissed by occasionally in the distance, tires slicing through standing water. "You barely talked back then," Dylan continued. "Always looking down at the floor. Guess some things never change." Marcus finally turned slightly toward him. His expression remained calm, unreadable. "People change, Dylan." Dylan laughed softly. "Yeah?" He took another slow step closer. "You sure about that?" The flashing lights painted alternating shadows across both men's faces while rain streamed steadily off the edge of Marcus's jawline. Somewhere farther down the highway thunder rolled low across the Carolina sky. And standing there beneath the storm, Marcus realized something unexpected. Dylan Mercer still needed someone beneath him to feel tall. Marcus held his hands loosely at his sides while rainwater streamed down the sleeves of his white shirt. Dylan circled him slowly, boots splashing through shallow puddles gathered along the shoulder. The patrol car lights flashed across the highway barrier in restless waves of red and blue. Somewhere overhead, power lines hummed softly against the storm. Marcus could feel the cold settling into his collar, but he did not move. Dylan stopped near the rear bumper and aimed the flashlight toward the inside of the Lexus again. "So what do you do these days?" he asked casually. Marcus answered without hesitation. "Law." Dylan let out a low whistle. "Law?" He grinned. "That is rich." The flashlight beam drifted across the leather folder again but moved away before focusing long enough to reveal the gold seal pressed into the corner. Dylan shut the driver's side door harder than necessary and leaned against the wet frame of the car. "You remember sophomore year?" he asked. Marcus stayed quiet. Dylan laughed softly to himself. Coach Patterson made everybody run laps because somebody pulled the fire alarm. He pointed the flashlight lazily toward Marcus. "That somebody was you." Marcus looked at him evenly. "No. It was not." Dylan shrugged. Did not matter. Everybody believed it anyway. The rain softened for a moment, turning into a steady hiss against the pavement. Marcus remembered that day clearly. The crowded hallway. The principal refusing to listen. Dylan standing near the lockers pretending to look shocked while Marcus sat outside the office waiting for his mother to pick him up. His mother had arrived wearing her Navy janitor uniform straight from work, exhaustion sitting heavy beneath her eyes. She had apologized 3 times to the principal before Marcus even spoke. That part stayed with him longer than the suspension itself. The way poverty trained people to apologize first and ask questions later. Dylan tilted his head slightly. "You know what is funny? You always acted like you were better than everybody." Marcus almost smiled at that. "Almost. I mostly remember trying to survive high school." Dylan smirked. "Come on. It was not that bad." Marcus looked out toward the darkness beyond the guardrail. Rainwater rolled down the steel barrier in thin silver lines beneath the flashing lights. "For you maybe." Dylan's expression tightened for a fraction of a second before disappearing again beneath practiced arrogance. He tapped the flashlight against his palm. "You still live around Raleigh?" "Sometimes." "Sometimes." Dylan repeated. "What does that mean?" Marcus did not answer immediately. His mind drifted briefly to the ceremony earlier that afternoon. The packed room inside the Capitol building. The polished wooden podium beneath bright lights. Reporters crowding near the stage while cameras clicked in rapid bursts. He remembered placing one hand on the Bible his mother once kept beside their apartment window and taking the oath with her silver bracelet wrapped quietly around his wrist beneath his cuff. His mother had passed 3 years ago. But tonight he could still hear her voice as clearly as the rain around him now. "Do not let bitterness decide who you become." Marcus looked back toward Dylan. "It means I travel for work." Dylan nodded slowly as if pretending to care. Then his expression shifted again. You got anything illegal in the vehicle? No weapons? No. Dylan stepped closer. You mind if I take a look anyway? Marcus knew he could refuse. He also knew exactly how this game worked. Highways became stages at night. Power looked different beneath flashing lights and storm clouds. A refusal would become suspicion. Suspicion would become escalation. So Marcus simply said, "Go ahead." Dylan smiled faintly like a man hearing confirmation of an old belief. He walked toward the passenger side and opened the door. Rain blew briefly into the interior. Papers shifted softly inside the car. Marcus watched him move things around carelessly, flashlight beam bouncing across the dashboard and seats. Then Dylan picked up the leather folder. "Well now," he muttered. "Fancy." He flipped it over casually without opening it. The state seal glimmered for half a second beneath the rotating patrol lights before his attention drifted elsewhere. He tossed it back onto the seat. Marcus felt a quiet ache settle somewhere deep in his chest. Not anger. Something older than anger. The realization that some people could stare directly at dignity and still refuse to recognize it. Dylan shut the passenger door and walked back around the front of the Lexus. "You know," he said, "guys like us from this town usually end up one of two ways." Marcus looked at him calmly. "And what way is that?" Dylan spread his arms slightly toward the cruiser lights behind him. "Either wearing the badge or getting stopped by it." The words hung there between them while thunder rolled low in the distance. Marcus studied Dylan carefully now. The expensive watch hidden beneath the uniform sleeve. The forced confidence. The restless energy behind his eyes. And suddenly Marcus understood something else too. Dylan had never really left high school. He had only found a different hallway to patrol. The wind shifted suddenly across the highway, carrying a colder wave of rain beneath the overpass ahead. Dylan stood with one hand resting against his duty belt while the patrol lights continued spinning behind him in endless circles of color. Marcus remained beside the Lexus, soaked shoulders catching flashes of blue and red like bruised light across dark fabric. Traffic had thinned even more now. Every passing car sounded distant, swallowed quickly by the storm. Dylan glanced toward the cruiser and then back at Marcus with the same restless expression men wore when silence stopped giving them control. "You know," he said slowly, "most people get nervous during a stop." Marcus answered calmly. "Most people probably have a reason to be." Dylan smirked faintly. "And you do not?" No. Dylan studied him again. The calm seemed to bother him more each minute. Marcus could almost see it happening beneath the surface. Dylan had expected discomfort. Maybe even fear. Instead he kept running into composure, and composure had a way of exposing insecurity faster than anger ever could. A second set of headlights appeared behind the patrol car. Another cruiser rolled onto the shoulder with tires hissing through standing water before stopping several yards back. A younger officer stepped out into the rain, adjusting his jacket collar against the wind. He could not have been older than 25. Clean haircut. Sharp posture. Still carrying the alertness of someone new enough to believe the uniform meant something honorable every second he wore it. Dylan waved him over casually. "Rookie backup," he muttered under his breath toward Marcus as though the phrase itself was amusing. The younger officer approached carefully. "Everything good, Officer Mercer?" Dylan nodded toward Marcus without looking at him. "Routine stop." Guy was drifting lanes. The younger officer gave Marcus a polite nod. "Sir." Marcus returned it quietly. Dylan tossed Marcus's license toward the younger officer. "Run him again." The rookie caught it and walked back toward the cruiser. Dylan folded his arms against the rain. "Department is different now," he said after a moment. "Everybody's scared of complaints. Cameras. Internal reviews." He laughed softly. "Back when we were kids, nobody questioned authority." Marcus looked at him steadily. "That was part of the problem." Dylan's jaw tightened slightly. "See, that right there." He pointed faintly toward Marcus. That attitude. Marcus did not respond. Dylan stepped closer again, lowering his voice. You always thought people were against you. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of his sleeve onto the pavement. Between them. Maybe because they were, Marcus answered quietly. The word settled into the storm heavier than shouting would have. Dylan looked away first. For a brief second his expression hardened into something colder, almost defensive. Then the mask returned. Everybody has excuses. Marcus watched the younger officer through the rain. The rookie sat inside the cruiser typing into the computer terminal, dashboard glow lighting half his face pale blue. Suddenly the young officer paused. Marcus could see it even from a distance. The subtle freeze. The second glance at the screen. Then another. Dylan kept talking without noticing. You know what happens where I grew up, he asked. Guys either become cops or they spend their lives dealing with them. Marcus remained still. There are other paths. Dylan laughed under his breath. Maybe for people with connections. Marcus almost responded to that. Almost. But instead he looked out beyond the highway where the city lights flickered faintly through rain and darkness. He remembered studying at a folding table inside a cramped apartment while his mother slept 2 hours before another overnight shift downtown. He remembered law school applications spread across borrowed library books. Nights delivering groceries. Weekends working security. Every step had cost something. Nobody had opened doors for him. He had simply learned how to keep knocking without letting humiliation turn into hatred. The rookie officer suddenly stepped out of the cruiser again, this time moving faster. Rain streaked across his uniform as he approached. Officer Mercer, he called carefully. Dylan turned halfway. What? The younger officer lowered his voice once he got closer, though Marcus could still hear pieces through the storm. Sir, I think there may be. Dylan frowned impatiently. Maybe what? The rookie glanced toward Marcus briefly before speaking lower again. Dylan snatched the license back from him with visible annoyance. You serious right now? The younger officer shifted awkwardly beneath the rain. I am just saying maybe we should. Dylan cut him off with a sharp wave of the hand. I know exactly what I am doing. The rookie fell silent, but uncertainty stayed written across his face. Marcus recognized the look immediately. It was the expression people wore when conscience collided with hierarchy. Dylan tucked the license back into his pocket instead of returning it. Step over here, he said suddenly to Marcus, motioning toward the front of the patrol car. Marcus walked forward without resistance. Water splashed beneath his shoes while the cruiser lights reflected across the wet pavement in distorted ribbons. Dylan positioned him near the hood beneath the glare of the headlights. The younger officer remained several feet away now, visibly tense. Dylan leaned closer toward Marcus and lowered his voice again. Funny thing is, he muttered, people like you always end up thinking the rules protect you. Marcus met his gaze evenly. The rules are supposed to protect everybody. Dylan smiled without warmth. That is not how the world works. Thunder rolled louder this time, closer now. Marcus looked at Dylan standing there beneath flashing lights and pouring rain, still clinging to the same small understanding of power he had carried since high school hallways. And for the first time that night, Marcus no longer felt anger toward him. Only disappointment. Rain hammered harder against the highway now, turning the shoulder into a ribbon of black water beneath the patrol lights. Marcus stood near the front of the cruiser with cold rain soaking through his shirt collar while Dylan paced slowly in front of him like a man trying to reclaim control of a room that no longer fully belonged to him. The younger officer lingered near the second cruiser several yards away, uneasy eyes shifting between Marcus and the glowing computer screen inside the vehicle. Dylan noticed it too. And that seemed to sharpen something inside him. You got someplace important to be tonight? Dylan asked suddenly. Marcus answered calmly. I already was. Dylan smirked faintly. Fancy answer. He glanced toward the Lexus again. Business meeting? Marcus looked at the rain sliding down the windshield of his car. Something like that. Dylan folded his arms. You know what I think. Marcus stayed silent. Dylan stepped closer beneath the flashing lights. I think people spend years pretending they changed. New suit. Better vocabulary. Nice little career. His smile faded slightly. But underneath? Same person. Marcus met his eyes evenly. That sounds more like fear than wisdom. The words landed quietly, but the effect was immediate. Dylan's jaw tightened. The rookie officer looked down at the pavement as if he suddenly wished he were somewhere else entirely. Dylan laughed once, short and dry. Still think you are the smartest guy in the room. Marcus shook rainwater from his sleeve slowly. No. I just learned that calm people make angry people uncomfortable. For the first time that night, Dylan stopped smiling altogether. Thunder cracked somewhere farther down the interstate, low and heavy enough to vibrate faintly through the wet pavement. A passing 18-wheeler roared by in the nearest lane, spraying mist across the shoulder before disappearing into darkness. Dylan stared at Marcus for several long seconds. Then he motioned sharply toward the hood of the cruiser. Place your hands right there. The rookie officer immediately looked up. Officer Mercer, Dylan cut him off without turning around. I said I know what I am doing. Marcus walked forward without resistance. Rainwater streamed across the black hood beneath the spinning emergency lights. He rested his palms against the cold metal and looked out toward the endless line of highway ahead. The younger officer shifted uneasily again. Sir, there is no flag on the vehicle and dispatch already cleared, Dylan snapped back at him. Then maybe dispatch missed something. Silence followed. Marcus could hear the rookie breathing harder now beneath the rain. Fear did not always sound loud. Sometimes it sounded exactly like this. Hesitation. Dylan moved closer behind Marcus, not touching him, but close enough for authority itself to become pressure. You know what your problem always was? Dylan asked quietly. Marcus kept his eyes forward. No pride. Rainwater dripped from Marcus's fingertips onto the hood. No, he answered calmly. My problem was surviving people who mistook cruelty for strength. Dylan exhaled sharply through his nose. There you go again. Acting like some victim. Marcus finally turned his head slightly. You really do not remember any of it, do you? Dylan frowned. Remember what? Marcus looked at him steadily beneath the flashing lights. The cafeteria. Junior year. You dumped chocolate milk across my textbooks because you thought it was funny. Dylan rolled his eyes immediately. We were kids. You told everybody I smelled like bleach because my mother cleaned office buildings downtown. Dylan's expression shifted impatiently now, defensive irritation creeping through the cracks. People joked around. That is life. Marcus nodded slowly to himself. That is exactly the problem. The rookie officer stared openly now, his discomfort growing more visible each second. Dylan noticed. Marcus saw the realization hit him almost instantly. The audience had changed. This was no longer just about humiliation. It was becoming exposure. Dylan stepped back and pointed toward the Lexus again. Open the trunk. Marcus obeyed quietly. The trunk lifted with a soft mechanical hum. Inside sat a neatly packed garment bag, 2 framed documents, and a dark leather briefcase secured beside an overnight bag. Dylan flashed the light across everything slowly. Then his attention snagged briefly on one of the framed documents partially covered beneath the garment bag. Gold trim. State seal. Official lettering. He narrowed his eyes slightly but did not pull it out. Instead he shut the trunk harder than necessary. You carrying a lot of important papers around at midnight, he muttered. Marcus answered simply. Some days matter. The younger officer suddenly stepped forward despite himself. Sir, Dylan turned sharply. What? The rookie hesitated before speaking carefully. I really think maybe we should wrap this up. Rain streamed down his forehead while patrol lights flickered across his tense face. Dylan stared at him in disbelief. You giving me instructions now? No, sir. Then stand down. The rookie stepped back immediately, but shame lingered in his expression. Marcus watched the entire exchange silently. Power always revealed itself most clearly in small moments. Not speeches. Not headlines. Just the way people behaved when nobody important seemed to be watching. Dylan walked back toward Marcus slowly. You know what is funny? He asked. Guys like you spend your whole lives thinking the system is against you. Marcus looked directly at him now. No, his voice stayed low and steady beneath the storm. Guys like me spend our whole lives learning exactly who the system protects. For the first time all night, Dylan had no immediate response. Only rain. Only flashing lights. Only the sound of his own breathing growing uneven beneath the dark Carolina sky. The storm deepened over the interstate, thick clouds swallowing what little moonlight remained above Raleigh. Rain rolled across the highway in silver sheets beneath the spinning patrol lights while Marcus stood beside the cruiser with water dripping steadily from his sleeves onto the pavement below. His hands rested loosely at his sides now, calm despite the tension hanging in the air around all three men. Dylan stared at him without speaking. Something had shifted. The confidence he wore so comfortably earlier now looked strained at the edges, like paint beginning to crack beneath heat. The younger officer stood near the second cruiser watching quietly, his expression caught somewhere between uncertainty and concern. Dispatch radio chatter crackled faintly through the rain. Codes. Locations. Traffic updates. Real police work continuing somewhere beyond this shoulder of highway while Dylan remained trapped inside a conversation he no longer controlled. Marcus glanced once toward the dark tree line beyond the guardrail. Pine branches bent beneath the wind. Water streamed through roadside drainage ditches in rushing currents. The night smelled like wet concrete and cold metal. Dylan finally broke the silence. You think you know everything about people? Marcus looked back at him evenly. No. I think people eventually show you who they are. Dylan scoffed under his breath. You still talking like some courtroom speech. Marcus almost smiled faintly at that. Habit, I guess. Dylan narrowed his eyes. You keep saying things like that. He stepped closer. Again, lowering his voice beneath the storm. Who exactly are you these days, Marcus? Marcus answered simply. Somebody who learned not to confuse authority with character. The rookie officer looked down immediately after hearing that. Dylan noticed. His frustration sharpened visibly now. You know what your problem is? Dylan asked. You always needed somebody to blame. Marcus shook rainwater from his hand slowly. No, Dylan. The difference is I stopped pretending certain things were normal. Thunder rolled louder overhead. Dylan laughed once, but there was no humor left in it now. You really think you are better than everybody? Marcus held his gaze. No. I just worked very hard not to become people who enjoyed humiliating others. That landed harder than the previous words. Dylan's face tightened immediately. The rookie officer shifted again, visibly uncomfortable standing between them. A passing SUV slowed slightly in the nearest lane before continuing through the rain. Dylan suddenly turned away from Marcus and walked toward the Lexus again with restless energy. He opened the driver's side door sharply and leaned farther into the vehicle this time, flashlight beam moving aggressively across the interior. Papers rustled. The leather folder slid partly onto the passenger seat. The gold state seal caught brightly beneath the rotating emergency lights. The rookie officer inhaled sharply. Sir, Dylan ignored him. Marcus remained still beside the cruiser. Rainwater slid down the side of his face, but his expression never changed. Dylan grabbed the folder fully now and opened it halfway. The moment stretched strangely quiet despite the storm. Marcus watched the patrol lights flicker across Dylan's face as his eye scanned the embossed heading on the first page. The color drained slowly from his expression. He blinked once. Then again. The rookie officer stepped forward carefully. Officer Mercer, Dylan stared down at the document in his hands. Appointment confirmation. State of North Carolina. Office of the State Attorney. Marcus Reed. Effective immediately. The word seemed to freeze the entire highway shoulder in place. Even the rain felt quieter for 1 suspended second. Dylan looked up slowly toward Marcus. His mouth opened slightly but no words came out. Marcus said nothing. He simply stood there beneath the storm with rain dripping from his suit sleeves while the red and blue lights washed across his face in slow repeating flashes. The rookie officer looked openly stunned now. Sir, that is, Dylan snapped the folder shut too quickly, almost dropping it in the process. Why did you not say something? The question came out harsher than intended, tangled with embarrassment and panic. Marcus answered calmly. You never asked. Dylan stared at him in disbelief. You could have told me who you were from the beginning. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Would it have changed how you treated me? Silence. Heavy silence. The rookie officer looked away first. Dylan's breathing became uneven beneath the rain. For the first time all night, the power dynamic cracked wide open in front of him. Not because Marcus raised his voice. Not because he threatened him. But because the truth had arrived quietly and left Dylan standing face to face with his own behavior. Marcus stepped closer slowly and held out his hand for the folder. Dylan hesitated before returning it. Their fingers brushed briefly against rain-soaked leather. Marcus tucked the folder carefully beneath his arm. You know what bothers me most? He asked quietly. Dylan said nothing. Marcus looked directly into his eyes now. It is not that you stopped me. Rainwater rolled down Dylan's jawline while the patrol lights reflected wildly behind him. It is that you only started seeing me as human after you saw a title. The word settled into Dylan harder than accusation ever could. The younger officer lowered his head slightly, shame flickering across his face too now, secondhand and quiet. Another flash of lightning split across the distant clouds, illuminating the soaked highway shoulder in white for half a heartbeat. Marcus looked past both officers toward the endless road ahead. Somewhere beyond this storm waited tomorrow morning. Press conferences. Courtrooms. Cameras. Responsibility. But here, on the side of a dark interstate beneath cold rain and spinning lights, all that remained was truth stripped bare. The rain eased gradually after the thunder passed, softening from a hard downpour into a steady whisper against the highway. Water rolled in thin streams along the shoulder beneath the patrol cars while red and blue lights continued spinning across the darkness in silent rotations. Marcus stood beside his Lexus with the leather folder tucked securely beneath his arm. His white shirt clung damply to his shoulders now, but his posture never changed. Calm. Grounded. Steady in a way that made the entire scene feel smaller around him. Dylan remained frozen several feet away, staring at the wet pavement like the road itself might offer an explanation for what had just happened. The younger officer shifted awkwardly beside the cruiser, unsure where to look anymore. The hierarchy of the night had rearranged itself completely in less than 30 seconds. And nobody seemed prepared for what came after that. Marcus slowly opened the driver's side door and placed the folder back inside the vehicle with careful hands. The gold seal disappeared beneath the dim interior light. He paused briefly before closing the door again. The sound echoed softly through the rain. Dylan finally spoke, though his voice sounded thinner now. Why would somebody like you still drive around alone this late? Marcus looked at him quietly for a moment. Because I spent most of my life not believing I needed protection to exist. Dylan swallowed once but said nothing. Marcus glanced toward the younger officer. What is your name? The rookie straightened immediately. Ethan Morales, sir. Marcus nodded once. How long have you been on the force, Officer Morales? 8 months, sir. Rainwater dripped steadily from Ethan's cap brim while he answered. Marcus studied him carefully, not with judgment, but with something closer to concern. Then remember this night. Ethan looked surprised by the softness in Marcus's tone. Marcus continued quietly. Not because of me. Because every badge eventually asks the same question. Dylan shifted uncomfortably nearby. Marcus kept his eyes on Ethan. Who do you become when nobody important seems to be watching? The younger officer lowered his gaze slightly. Somewhere down the highway, headlights moved through the storm like distant stars before disappearing into darkness again. Ethan nodded once. Yes, sir. Dylan exhaled sharply through his nose, still unable to fully meet Marcus's eyes. You are really going to turn this into some lesson now? Marcus turned toward him slowly. There was no anger in his face. Somehow that made the silence heavier. No, he said quietly. Life already did that. Dylan looked away again immediately. The patrol lights reflected across the soaked fabric of his uniform while rainwater gathered along the edge of his jaw. Marcus could see the conflict happening inside him now. Embarrassment. Defensiveness. Fear. But beneath all of it sat something deeper and far more fragile. Shame. The kind people spend entire lives avoiding because it forces them to see themselves clearly for the first time. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the roof of his car. Cold rainwater coated the black paint beneath his fingers. Do you know what I used to think about people like you? He asked softly. Dylan frowned slightly without answering. When I was younger, I thought cruelty came from hate. Marcus looked out toward the dark highway beyond the guardrail. But most of the time it comes from insecurity. People hurt others because they are terrified of feeling small themselves. Dylan stared at him now, stunned by the absence of hostility in his voice. Marcus gave a faint tired smile that disappeared almost immediately. That took me years to understand. Ethan remained silent beside the cruiser, listening carefully. Marcus glanced upward briefly as rain tapped softly against the hood beside him. The clouds had begun thinning slightly overhead. Tiny breaks in the darkness revealed faint traces of moonlight struggling through. My mother used to tell me something after difficult days, Marcus said. She cleaned office buildings downtown for almost 20 years. Dylan blinked slowly. Marcus continued. Every night she would come home smelling like floor polish and bleach. Her hands were always rough from chemicals. A small silence followed. But she never let bitterness into our apartment. Dylan shifted again, uncomfortable beneath the weight of words that carried no accusation and yet exposed everything. Marcus looked directly at him now. She said dignity is the one thing nobody can hand you and nobody can take away unless you help them do it. The highway remained quiet except for rain and distant traffic. Ethan swallowed hard beside the cruiser. Dylan's face tightened slightly as if hearing something he did not know how to respond to. Marcus checked the time briefly on the dashboard clock glowing through the windshield. Nearly midnight now. Tomorrow morning would arrive quickly. News stations would replay inauguration footage. Reporters would analyze speeches. Politicians would shake hands beneath cameras. But here on the shoulder of a dark interstate, none of those titles seemed important anymore. Only character remained. Only choices. Marcus stepped closer toward Dylan one final time. You asked earlier who I became, he said quietly. Dylan finally forced himself to meet his eyes fully. Marcus's voice stayed calm beneath the rain. I became someone who refused to let humiliation teach me how to humiliate other people. The words settled over the three men with the weight of truth spoken softly instead of loudly. No one moved for several long seconds. Then Marcus reached into the open window of the Lexus, retrieved his keys, and closed the door gently behind him while the storm slowly began to pass overhead. The rain thinned into a cold mist drifting across the interstate while Marcus stood beside his Lexus with the car keys resting quietly in his palm. The emergency light still painted the highway in restless flashes, but the tension had changed shape now. Earlier the shoulder had felt tight with control and intimidation. Now it felt exposed. Hollowed out by truth neither officer could put back where it had been before. Dylan remained near the front of the cruiser, shoulders stiff beneath his soaked uniform, eyes fixed somewhere beyond Marcus as though staring hard enough into the darkness might undo the last 20 minutes. Ethan Morales stood silently near the second patrol car with rainwater dripping from the edge of his sleeves, still absorbing everything he had witnessed tonight. Marcus opened the driver's side door halfway, then paused when another pair of headlights appeared farther down the highway. Unlike the earlier cruiser, this vehicle moved quickly and directly toward them with purpose. A black state sedan rolled onto the shoulder behind the police units before coming to a smooth stop. Its headlights cut bright white through the lingering rain. Dylan frowned immediately. Ethan straightened instinctively. The driver's side door opened and a tall older man stepped out beneath the mist wearing a dark overcoat over a charcoal suit. Even before the man reached them, Marcus recognized the steady stride. Captain Howard Bennett. Former prosecutor. Current head of interstate legal operations for the state. One of the men who had personally pushed Marcus's appointment through despite political resistance from half the room. Howard looked first toward Marcus, relief crossing his face immediately. There you are. His deep voice carried calmly across the wet pavement. We lost track of your route after the reception. Marcus gave a faint nod. Unexpected delay. Howard's eyes shifted toward the patrol cars, then toward Dylan. Years inside courtrooms had sharpened Howard's instincts beyond words. He understood tension before anyone explained it. Ethan stepped back slightly the moment Howard approached. Dylan, however, remained frozen where he stood. Howard glanced briefly at the flashing lights reflecting across Marcus's damp shirt and then toward the folder still visible inside the Lexus. The pieces connected quickly behind his eyes. Officer, Howard said calmly to Dylan, do you know who this man is? The question landed softly but carried the weight of authority stronger than shouting ever could. Dylan swallowed once before answering. Yes, sir. I just found out. Howard looked at him carefully for several long seconds. Rain tapped quietly against the highway while distant traffic hissed through wet lanes beyond the shoulder. Then you understand, Howard continued, that you are speaking to the newly appointed state attorney overseeing prosecutorial conduct and law enforcement review across this district. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Dylan's face lost what little color remained in it. Howard glanced toward Marcus again. We had judges waiting for your arrival downtown. Marcus answered quietly. This seemed more important. Howard followed Marcus's gaze toward Dylan and understood exactly what he meant. A long silence settled over the four men. The mist drifted lazily through the emergency lights now, softening the harsh flashes into blurred streaks of red and blue. Dylan finally forced himself to speak. Sir. I did not know. Marcus looked at him steadily. No. You did not. Dylan's breathing grew uneven again. If I had known, Marcus interrupted gently. That is the point. Howard remained silent beside them, watching carefully. Dylan stared at Marcus with a desperation that had not existed earlier that night. I was only doing my job. Marcus nodded once. Part of it. Dylan blinked. Marcus continued quietly. But somewhere along the way it stopped being about safety and started becoming about power. Ethan closed his eyes briefly after hearing that. Howard folded his hands calmly in front of him beneath the rain. Marcus stepped forward slightly now, his voice remaining calm enough to make every word heavier. Do you know what concerns me most about tonight? Dylan said nothing. Marcus looked toward the flashing patrol lights behind him. Not the stop. Not the questions. Not even the assumptions. He turned back toward Dylan. It is how comfortable you were before you thought I mattered. The word settled deeply into the cold night air. Dylan lowered his head at last. No defense came this time. No sarcasm. No excuses. Only silence. Ethan shifted quietly beside the cruiser, shame written plainly across his young face too. Marcus looked at him briefly and softened his tone. You still have time to decide what kind of officer you become. Ethan nodded once, visibly emotional despite trying to hide it. Howard glanced toward Marcus with quiet approval but said nothing. The older man understood moments like this did not need speeches. They needed honesty. Marcus finally looked back toward Dylan one last time. You asked earlier if people really change. Dylan slowly lifted his eyes again. Rainwater slid down both sides of his face while the patrol lights reflected weakly across them. Marcus's voice stayed low and steady beneath the fading storm. Tonight was your answer. No one moved after that. The highway stretched endlessly into darkness ahead while mist drifted beneath fading rain and spinning lights. Somewhere beyond the clouds, morning was slowly beginning to approach. The mist continued drifting across the interstate in slow silver waves while the emergency lights reflected against the wet asphalt like fading embers. The storm had nearly passed now. Only scattered drops fell from the dark Carolina sky, tapping softly against metal and glass. Marcus stood beside the Lexus with one hand resting lightly near the open driver's side door while Captain Howard Bennett remained near the state sedan behind him. Ethan Morales stayed beside the second patrol car, silent and still, carrying the look of someone who had witnessed a lesson he would remember long after tonight ended. Dylan Mercer had not moved. His shoulders looked heavier now beneath the soaked uniform, the confidence that once filled his posture completely stripped away beneath the flashing lights and cold midnight air. For several long moments nobody spoke. The highway itself seemed quieter than before, as though even the traffic understood something irreversible had happened here tonight. Marcus glanced briefly toward the horizon where faint traces of lighter gray had begun separating from the darkness. Morning was still far away, but night no longer felt endless. Dylan finally took a slow step forward. Marcus, the name sounded unfamiliar in his mouth now. Softer. Smaller somehow. Marcus turned toward him calmly. Dylan swallowed once before continuing. I was wrong. The words came slowly, like something dragged painfully upward after years buried beneath pride. Rainwater slid from the edge of Dylan's jaw as he forced himself to continue speaking. Back then. Tonight. All of it. Marcus remained quiet. Dylan looked down briefly at the soaked pavement before meeting Marcus's eyes again. I kept thinking respect came from power. He gave a weak laugh without humor. Badge. Fear. Control. The flashing patrol lights washed red across his face before fading blue again. But standing here right now, his voice faltered slightly. I do not think I have ever felt smaller. Ethan lowered his gaze again after hearing that. Howard remained silent near the sedan, watching with the patience of someone old enough to understand that certain moments could not be rushed. Marcus studied Dylan carefully now. Not as a rival. Not as a victim confronting a bully. Just as a man finally seeing himself clearly for the first time in years. Do you know something strange? Marcus asked quietly. Dylan frowned faintly. Marcus looked out toward the highway beyond the guardrail. When I was younger, I used to imagine moments like this all the time. A passing truck hummed through the distance beneath wet tires before vanishing into darkness again. Marcus continued softly. I thought one day success would feel like revenge. Dylan listened silently. Marcus shook his head slightly. But it does not. The mist curled lazily around the patrol lights while cold air drifted through the shoulder of the highway. Because revenge keeps you chained to the same pain forever. Dylan stared at him without speaking. Marcus looked back toward him calmly. I did not spend 20 years fighting to become somebody consumed by bitterness. The word settled heavily into the quiet night. Dylan blinked hard once, emotion flickering across his face before disappearing beneath exhaustion and shame. I do not know how to fix this, he admitted quietly. Marcus nodded once. Maybe you cannot fix the past. Dylan lowered his eyes again. Marcus stepped a little closer. But you can decide what kind of man walks away from tonight. Ethan looked up slightly after hearing that. Marcus turned toward him briefly. That applies to both of you. The younger officer straightened immediately. Yes, sir. Marcus gave him a faint nod before looking back toward Dylan. You had authority tonight, he said quietly. The question is what you choose to do with it next time. Dylan's breathing steadied. Slowly as the weight of those words settled in. No threats. No humiliation. Somehow that mercy cut deeper than punishment could have. Howard finally stepped forward beside Marcus, adjusting his overcoat against the lingering mist. The car downtown can wait another hour, he said softly. But sunrise will not. Marcus glanced toward the faint pale edge beginning to appear beneath the clouds far off across the horizon. The darkness was thinning now. Dylan looked at Marcus one final time. Why are you being decent to me after everything? The question sounded honest. Almost confused. Marcus considered it quietly before answering. Because somebody has to stop teaching people that cruelty is strength. The words hung in the cool air between them while water dripped steadily from the patrol car bumper onto the pavement below. Dylan looked away again, visibly shaken by the simplicity of the answer. Ethan slowly removed his cap for a moment, running a hand through damp hair before replacing it again. Howard opened the rear door of the state sedan but waited without rushing Marcus. Marcus reached for the Lexus door handle, then paused one last time. Officer Morales. Ethan immediately looked up. So? Marcus's voice remained calm. Do not let fear of fitting in become stronger than your conscience. Ethan nodded firmly this time. I will remember that, sir. Marcus gave a final quiet nod before climbing into the Lexus. The engine started softly beneath the fading storm while the patrol lights continued spinning across the wet highway shoulder. Dylan remained standing there beneath those lights, watching silently as the man he once tried to make feel small drove away with more dignity than anyone else on that road combined. The Lexus moved quietly through the fading storm, tires humming against wet asphalt as Marcus drove south beneath a sky slowly surrendering to dawn. The interstate stretched nearly empty ahead of him now, long ribbons of highway reflecting pale silver beneath scattered streetlights. Rainwater still clung to the windshield in thin trembling trails, but the storm itself had passed. Behind him, the flashing patrol lights grew smaller in the rear view mirror until they finally disappeared into darkness altogether. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the steering wheel while the other remained near the leather folder on the passenger seat beside him. The gold state seal caught faint traces of early morning light leaking through the clouds overhead. For several miles he drove in complete silence. No radio. No phone calls. Just the steady rhythm of tires on wet pavement and the quiet sound of his own breathing filling the car. The events of the night replayed slowly in fragments across his mind. Dylan standing beneath spinning lights with old arrogance stitched into every word. Ethan Morales watching carefully from the edge of the scene, caught between obedience and conscience. Captain Howard stepping out into the rain at exactly the right moment. But strangely, the memory Marcus could not stop returning to was not the humiliation or the confrontation. It was the look on Dylan's face after the truth settled in. Not fear. Not even panic. Recognition. The painful kind that arrives when somebody finally sees the distance between who they pretended to be and who they actually became. Marcus exhaled slowly and loosened his grip on the wheel. Outside, the clouds had begun breaking apart completely now. Soft grey light spread across the Carolina horizon while pine trees rolled past in dark quiet lines beside the interstate. The world looked washed clean. His phone vibrated softly against the center console. Marcus glanced at the screen. Angela Reed. He answered through the hands-free speaker. You alive? His younger sister asked immediately. Marcus smiled faintly for the first time all night. Barely. Angela laughed softly on the other end. Howard called me. Said your phone disappeared for almost an hour. I thought maybe politicians already kidnapped you. Marcus shook his head gently while driving. Just got delayed. You sound tired. He looked out through the windshield at the pale morning light slowly growing stronger ahead. Long night. A brief silence followed. Angela knew him too well to push immediately. Something happened, she asked quietly. Marcus considered the question for a moment. I ran into somebody from high school. Good somebody or bad somebody? Marcus almost answered automatically. Then he stopped himself. Complicated, he said softly. Angela hummed knowingly. Usually means bad. Marcus smiled again despite himself. The tension in his chest had begun easing somewhere during the drive. You remember Mom always saying people reveal themselves under pressure. Angela laughed gently. Every other day. Marcus nodded slowly to himself. She was right. The call quieted for a moment while morning continued unfolding across the interstate. Birds had begun appearing along the roadside now, tiny movements against the damp grass beneath the trees. The storm no longer felt close. She would have been proud tonight, Angela said suddenly. Marcus blinked once at the words. He tightened his grip on the wheel slightly before relaxing again. Outside the windshield, sunrise finally pushed fully through the clouds, pouring soft gold light across the wet highway. Everything glowed. The road. The trees. The rainwater still gathered along the shoulder. Marcus swallowed quietly. I hope so. Angela's voice softened too. Marcus, she already was. Silence settled gently inside the car after that. Not painful silence. The kind that feels full instead of empty. Marcus remembered his mother standing at the apartment stove late at night after shifts downtown, still wearing rubber gloves pushed halfway down her wrists while steam rose from cheap instant soup. He remembered her tired smile every time report cards arrived. The way she used to straighten his collar before scholarship interviews even when they barely had enough money for groceries that week. Most of all, he remembered the certainty in her voice whenever the world tried convincing him he was smaller than he really was. Do not let hard people harden you. The memory sat warmly in his chest while sunlight slowly overtook the last shadows of the storm. Marcus drove another several miles before the Raleigh skyline finally appeared ahead in the distance, glass buildings glowing gold beneath the sunrise. His city. His responsibility now. Courtrooms. Reporters. Cases. Entire systems waiting for leadership. But strangely, the wait no longer felt intimidating. Only necessary. Marcus reached toward the passenger seat and rested his hand briefly on the leather folder beside him. Water droplets still clung to the edge from the rain earlier that night. Proof that even important things sometimes arrived soaked by storms. He smiled faintly at the thought. Far behind him on a dark stretch of interstate, Dylan Mercer still stood beside flashing patrol lights with dawn slowly rising over the highway shoulder. And maybe for the first time in his life, he finally understood what real authority looked like. It did not shout. It did not humiliate. It did not need fear to prove it existed. It simply stood calmly in the rain and refused to become cruel back.